Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to the Meiji Guillotine Murders by Fūtarō Yamada, translated by Bryan Karetnyk. The corpse that cradled its own head. The following relates the particulars of an exceptionally difficult case in which a Razotsu who happened to be conducting surveillance discovered outside the walls of a certain villa in Imado a large naked man whose body had been defiled and whose head had been cut off. Both the identity of the man and the significance of the circumstances in which he had been found were a mystery. From a report made by Chief Inspector Toshiyoshi Kawaji of the Imperial Prosecuting Office. Chapter 1. It was the 28th day of the 12th lunar month, and the sun was setting on the 3rd year of Emperor Meiji's reign. In the jail at Kodenmacho, the rebel Tatsuo Komoi had been put to death by Gasaburo Yoshifusa, who was a third son of the Tokugawa executioner Asaemon Yamada VII. I was only 17 at the time, the boy would recall in later years, by then having taken on the family name and profession. It was the month of Shiwasu in the zodiac year of the metal horse, and all throughout Edo rice cakes were being pounded for the season's festivities. Although the New Year's fair at Yagenbori was taking place, I had been called upon that day to behead Tatsuo Komoi, and so I made my way to the jail at Kodenma-cho. The former retainer of the Yonezawa domain had a formidable reputation, and the prospect of beheading him was an onerous one, unlike that of executing any common criminal. He had been subjected to a brutal interrogation, during which they tried to make him divulge the names of his comrades. But no matter how they tortured him, he would not give in. In those days, the torments inflicted on him would have been merciless beyond belief, but having burnt the round robin, he sacrificed himself for his country with complete equanimity. Round robin. A written petition, memorial, or protest to which the signatures are affixed in a circle so as not to indicate who signed first. A statement signed by several persons. Round robin. Equanimity. Evenness of mind, especially under stress. Equanimity. But having burnt the round robin, he sacrificed himself for his country with complete equanimity. He was of such a small physical stature that I do not know where he found such boldness and courage. It amazed me to think that here was Komoi, who had made so impressive a name for himself throughout the country, and yet in an instant he was to disappear with the morning dew. He met his end with such unswerving composure that even now I feel only the deepest respect for him. Even though the round robin containing the names of his comrades had been burnt, as many as 59 men were arrested for conspiring to overthrow the government. And so, on that fateful day, it was not just Komoi who was to be executed, but also 13 other ringleaders. The setting was the by now familiar execution ground, and both Kazuki and Kawaji were in attendance. The role of the Imperial Prosecuting Office was not only to monitor government officials, but also to root out sedition, and so it cannot be said that these two had nothing to do with the Komoi case whatsoever. But since neither of them had played a leading role in the investigation, and since both of them happened to be otherwise unengaged, they were ordered to observe this rare spate of executions. Spate. A large number or amount. Spate. They were ordered to observe this rare spate of executions. A short while before his execution, Komoi asked to recite a poem of his own composition, permission for which was granted by Kawaji. At death, I fear no dying, as in living, I steal no life. The brilliance of the sun is rivaled by the virtue of men. How insignificant my poor self, against the great wall of 10,000 leagues. After he spoke these lines, his voice reverberated throughout the execution ground, and went on long after his death. After the 14 corpses had been removed, the blood had been washed away, and the executioner and the other officials had gone. The place seemed even more like the underworld, frozen amid the cold twilight. The headsman today was absurdly young, don't you think? Said Kazuki, when he and Kawaji were the only ones left. He's Yamada's third son, apparently. The old man's getting old. His eldest, Genzo, was supposed to take over, but that one's seemingly a bit of a drinker and a womanizer, so he can't be relied on. The word is that this one actually likes the job, and is a master of his craft too. He bungled a few cuts towards the end, though. Well, he did have 14 to get through. If they'd used my machine, there wouldn't have been any mistakes, said Kazuki, glancing towards the little shed in the corner of the execution ground where the guillotine was stored. What can I say? The powers that be decided that the shishi deserved the honor of being beheaded the old-fashioned way. You know, in France, even the king was put to the guillotine. If I were you, I'd content myself with seeing it used for those officials who are a disgrace to their office. Of the 6 assassins who had killed Shonan Yokoi, the 4 shishi who had been arrested shortly after the incident, including Tsuge Shirozaemon, had received a stay of execution after the Directorate of the Imperial Prosecuting Office intervened. This had not been indefinite, however, and when the executions finally came to pass in the 10th lunar month, they were again carried out by the headsman. Indeed, until now, The guillotine that Kazuki had taken such pains to procure had been used only for the worst criminals, although some exceptions had been made for corrupt officials. The reason being that the Imperial Prosecuting Office had accepted Kazuki's argument that, under the new government policies, corruption was to be treated on a par with the worst kinds of petty crime. Hence, all of the perpetrators hitherto mentioned in this tale had already lost their heads under the iron blade of the guillotiner. Anyway, you'll have another customer for it before long, said Kawaji. You mean Yamashiroya? The two men looked at each other and laughed feebly. Just then, they heard a strange commotion coming from inside the prison. They rushed from the execution block through the side door and into the jailhouse. There, by one of the interrogation rooms, they encountered a group of jailers and Razotsu who had come running from the main entrance. All were crowding around one of the prisoner servants who had his head slumped on his chest. He could only have been around 20 years old. What's going on here? Kazuki asked. Take a look at this, sir, a jailer replied, holding something up in one of his hands. Kazuki and Kawaji gazed at the object in astonishment. Why, that's Kumoi's head, isn't it? Sure enough, it was the head of Tatsuo Kumoi, which had been parted from his body only a short while ago. The guard at the gate stopped him when he saw him trying to leave with something big wrapped in a furoshiki under his arm. Turns out he was trying to take this away, sir. Oh, what for? That's just what we're about to find out. In view of his suspicious behavior, the servant was taken immediately to an interrogation room where he was subjected to a barrage of questions. At first, pale and trembling, he told them that his name was Zenkichi and that he had been taken on as a servant in the prison only 3 months previously. But later, he confessed that his name was, in fact, Zenosuke Amanomiya, and that he had once been a lowly vassal of the shogun. As he spoke, little by little, his face took on a proud aspect of defiance that belied his former rank. I'd sooner feed Komoi-sensei's remains to the stray dogs at Kozukapara than see them taken to the Imperial University to be dissected, he said. So I tried to take his head at least, hoping to give him the proper burial he deserves. What? Said Kazuki. He's to be taken to the East College to be dissected? True though this was, it was news to both Kazuki and Kawaji. In those days, the East College, long before it became the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Tokyo, was the domain of Tadanori Ishiguro, the future Surgeon General of the Imperial Japanese Army. For teaching purposes, he later recorded. I had repeatedly asked the government to release the bodies of executed criminals. Finally, they acquiesced. Acquiesced. A-C-Q-U-I-E-S-C-E. Acquiesce. To accept, comply, or submit tacitly or passively. Acquiesced. Synonyms include agree, assent, come round, consent, subscribe. Finally, they acquiesced, and the first such body delivered to me was that of Kumoi. I remember it especially well because it was just a headless torso. It would surely have surprised Komoi to learn that he was to be the first person to be dissected in Meiji, Japan. His head had actually been destined for public display, but that Amanomiya had worked his way into the prison with the express intent of stealing Komoi's remains was now beyond any doubt. It was only natural that questions were asked about Amanomiya and whether he had been a co-conspirator of Komoi's. But it so happened that the lax security around the execution was also raised. Who was in charge? Kawaji asked, marching out of the interrogation room, leaving Kazuki to run after him. In one corner of the execution ground, there was a little hut known as the last office, where the dead bodies were kept. The headless corpse would be stored there temporarily, and then later that day or the next, they would be taken to Kozu Kapara and buried, though dumped might be a better word, and needless to say, no last offices were given. "You!" cried Kawaji as he entered the little hut and saw Sergeant Ichinohata standing there, disconsolate. Disconsolate. Cheerless, a clutch of disconsolate houses. Dejected, downcast, disconsolate. "You!" cried Kawaji as he entered the little hut and saw Sergeant Ichinohata standing there, disconsolate. The man who always looked so pitiful seemed to be on the verge of tears. "I haven't seen anything like this in a long time," he said, turning to Kawaji. "I can't bear to look at it." That, of course, was no excuse. But when Kawaji and Kazuki saw the mass of coffins lined up there, even they felt a little unnerved. These were not new coffins, although strictly speaking, they were not old either. They had been cobbled together from old reclaimed boards which were already discolored by all the blood oozing through the cracks. There were 14 of them in total, a truly gruesome spectacle, and not one of them had its lid on. "I'd set aside Komoi-san's head, since it's to be put on public display," Ichinohata began explaining. However, the two chief inspectors just stood there in silence, paying no attention to what he was saying. The bodies had all been crammed into the coffins, their gaping necks in full view and their heads resting in their hands. Naturally, this was not the first time that the two had seen such a sight, and yet, far more disturbing than the grisliness of the beheading was the surreal, otherworldly vision of these convicts, in a practice carried over from the Tokugawa era, cradling their own severed heads. Chapter 2. Shortly after the 4th year of the Emperor Meiji's reign began, there was another incident that shook the nation. In the early hours of the 9th day of the first month, Vice Minister Saneyomi Hirosawa was murdered. This was the third assassination of a high-profile government official in a year. after those of Shonan Yokoi and Masujiro Omura. What made matters worse was that while first two had been carried out in Kyoto, this killing had taken place right in the imperial capital. No matter how many criminals they caught and executed, it seems there was no end to these disturbing events. And as the new government entered its fourth year, violence yet stalked the country. Needless to say, the Imperial Prosecuting Office, which was still in charge of public order, was alarmed by this assassination and desperately tried to seek out the perpetrators. In the end, however, they were never caught, and the case remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Restoration. On the night in question, Hirosawa had been with his mistress at his residence in the Fujimicho neighborhood of Gojimachi when the assailants broke in and killed him with as many as 15 blows of their swords. The mistress testified that there had been only 2 or 3 culprits, but she too had been struck on her right temple and lost consciousness. So they were never identified. Was this an act of sedition, as was the case with Yokoi and Omura? Sedition, incitement of resistance to or insurrection against lawful authority. Sedition. Was this an act of sedition, as was the case with Yokoi and Omura? Or had Hirosawa, who once ranked alongside Kido as one of the leading figures in Chōshū, been a victim of the then intensifying power struggle between Chōshū and Satsuma? Or could it have been the result of internal fighting within the Chōshū faction itself, or even a settling of old scores? Suspects were systematically rounded up based on all these hypotheses, but there were just too many of them, and the authorities were unable to narrow the search. Naturally, Kawaji and Kazuki made a show of embarrassment over the situation. In reality, however, they felt rather indifferent, although only they knew this. Neither of them had been much impressed by the fact that Hirosawa had been in bed with his mistress. The interrogation had revealed, moreover, that while the mistress was possessed of a rare beauty, even by Tokyo standards, her mind appeared to be stuffed with cotton wool, and she had such loose morals that it was rumored she gave herself to almost any man who asked. And yet, maybe this is somehow connected with the Yamashiroya case, said Kazuki. I haven't seen anything to suggest that so far, replied Kawaji, but it's certainly possible. The Yamashiroya case was one that they had been investigating secretly since the autumn of the previous year. The man at the center of it all, Wasuke Yamashiroya, ran a trading company in Yokohama with 15 offices, a warehouse, and 480 employees, which was an unusually large outfit for the time. As a purveyor to the Imperial Japanese Army, he single-handedly managed the purchase of munitions from abroad. In those days, the top brass of the army consisted almost exclusively of men from Chōshū, and it seemed that Yamashiroya had received this special warrant because he had, at one time, been a commander of the volunteer militia there. That autumn, it had come to the attention of the Imperial Prosecuting Office that Yamashiroya had lost a vast amount of money, some $150,000 in the raw silk market. An investigation was launched after Sergeant Imokawa reported these particulars, having heard them from Gingo Kishida. The raw silk market had plummeted because of the Franco-Prussian War that broke out in the summer of the previous year. And even for a businessman like Yamashiroya, $150,000 was an extraordinary sum of money. And where had the capital come from? An internal investigation revealed that it had apparently come from the army, as its reserves for purchasing ordnance had been falling year on year. Yamashiroya had proposed to invest what capital there was, thereby not only preventing it from dwindling, but actually increasing its value. And so the Ministry of War, placing its faith in his business acumen, had seemingly given him the money as an unsecured loan. Yamashiroya had then put it into the raw silk market and made an almighty mess of things. To make matters worse, $150,000 was the equivalent of around 800,000 yen, or 2% of the national budget. Was all Kazuki had to say. They had no solid evidence, and besides, the case involved the army. The natural place to start would have been Yamashiroya, but through their carelessness, he had managed to slip the net. Wherever they looked, they were left with only hypotheses. Then, towards the end of the previous year, Yasutari Yausa, the first assistant finance director at the Ministry of War, left his post. Yuasa was another one who had served in the Chōshū militia. He had even lost an arm in combat during his period of service. Yet, this one-armed soldier had proved to be a very capable accountant, and so he had risen up in the Ministry of War. The Razotsu were ordered to follow him, and thus they found that he dined out frequently with Yamashiroya's chief clerk, a certain Ahei Arisaka. Excited by this link, they began to delve deeper, but then Yuasa moved with his family back to Chōshū. He knows we're watching him, Kazuki had said. The investigation had stalled, and the only thing left was to find the chink in Yamashiroya's armor. As far as the Imperial Prosecuting Office was concerned, that was where it had all begun. Could the Vice Minister Hirosawa's murder have anything to do with this scandal brewing in the Ministry of War? Kawaji and Kazuki exchanged a knowing look, but there was nothing they could do unless they could form a picture over the culprits. The month wore on, and the criminals remained at large. Then, one day, quite by chance, Kazuki and Kawaji happened to receive two startling reports. The first came when Sergeant Saruki nervously poked his head around the door of their office. Sirs, it looks like Kinpei Kobayashi's dead! What? Cried Kawaji. When did this happen? I haven't been there lately, so I've only just heard about it. He apparently died on the 7th. What did he die of? They think it was a stroke, sir. Kawaji stood there, taking in the information. Who exactly is this Kinpei Kobayashi? Kobayashi? Asked Kazuki with a quizzical look. I've heard that name somewhere before. You remember the Sawamura case? He ran the shop where Saruki here pawned your binoculars. Ah, yes, I remember now. Kazuki scratched his head. The fat old man with the beetroot face? It's little wonder he had a stroke. Apparently, they didn't tell the neighbors about the funeral. The rumor is that the old boy died on top of Okino. They didn't quite know what to say to this, and just as they were looking at each other in embarrassment, the second report arrived. It came from Sergeant Imokawa, trying to catch his breath. Sirs, Yamishiroya's legged it! What? Wasuke? Where? To France! The two chief inspectors were flabbergasted. How could you have let this happen again? Kawaji shouted. Imokawa was supposed to have been conducting surveillance down in Yokohama. He had been ordered to keep an eye on Yamishiroya's movements and to follow him whenever the situation called for it. Imokawa told them that around 10 o'clock that morning, Yamashiroya and his chief clerk Arisaka had left the office and set off on foot towards the wharf. The Razotsu thought it was odd that Yamishiroya was wearing Western-style clothes and that Arisaka was carrying a large bag, but had assumed that they intended to visit some of the large trading firms on the seafront. As he followed them, however, Yamishiroya boarded one of the barges and vanished onto one of the enormous steamers anchored in the bay. Imokawa had been so horrified by this turn of events that he grabbed Arisaka while he was still standing there, seeing Yamishiroya off. The clerk told him that he was heading off to conduct some business in France at the request of the Ministry of War, and that his passage had been booked on the French ship Marseille, which was to depart shortly. Imokawa panicked and, without a moment's delay, ran all the way back to Tokyo. He's fled, hasn't he? Kawaji groaned. Or has been made to flee, said Kazuki. First, Yaosa's return to Choshu, and now Yamishiroya's flight abroad. It was clear that both of them had got wind that the Imperial Prosecuting Office was looking into the case, and now they were trying to draw a veil of darkness over everything. But to flee to France, this had caught them unawares. Enough! Barked Kawaji, getting to his feet. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to bring Yamishiroya's chief clerk in and have a little word with him. We're going to Yokohama. Imokawa, you're with me. And with that, he left, leaving Kazuki and Saruki behind. When Kawaji reached Yamashiroya's office in Yokohama, however, he found that the chief clerk, Ihei Arisaka, had failed to return after seeing his employer off. It looked as though he, too, had gone to ground. Chapter 3. It was in the middle of the second lunar month when Kawaji arrested Okino, the former mistress of the moneylender Kinpei Kobayashi. According to Saruki, he had died while having relations with her, but even so, his business ventures had been extensive, and so it was somewhat odd that the funeral should have been held in such secrecy and with such haste, and without involving any of the neighbors. In the case of the severed leg, Okino, of course, had been prevailed upon by Tateki Maki to play a part in the crime. Kazuki's understanding of it was that the official had threatened her somehow, and so she had not been charged and got off with only a caution. Now, however, she had been arrested on a separate charge and taken to the police station in Yagenbori for questioning, where eventually she confessed to poisoning her lover. Although the death had struck Kawaji as suspicious, it was the woman's confession that surprised him. Okino had apparently dissolved some Iwami Ginzan rat poison in hot water and given it to Kobayashi as a cold remedy. But that was not the surprising part. The fact of the matter was that Okino had been carrying on a secret affair with another man. Okino had been Kobayashi's mistress, but in the last year the novelty had begun to wear off for her, and now he just forced his grotesque caresses on her. Then Okino fell pregnant, which did not go unnoticed by Kobayashi. Still, difficult though this predicament was, Kawaji would never have expected it to drive her to murder. Kawaji was then shocked to learn that the adulteress's new lover was none other than the actor Rikaku Arashi, and that the reason she had been unable to refuse Maki's request was that he had found out about the affair through Sawamura and was using it to blackmail her. At last, thought Kawaji, the details of that case all made sense now. When Kazuki learned of this, he looked at Kawaji in disbelief. "The only thing I don't understand," said Kawaji, "is why Maki didn't tell us that. Not that telling us would have saved his head, mind you. I told him that there were two ways to go. One, the old Japanese way of beheading. The other, a new Western method using the guillotine. I said that if he conducted himself with the dignity befitting a government official, there would be a degree of compassion shown in the manner in which he died. Maybe he wanted to be beheaded the old way." Kazuki laughed. "Rice and bread nourish the body just as well as each other, but a Japanese will always choose rice. I think the guillotine is a more fitting way to go for corrupt officials, and I told him as much." Kazuki ought to have been as curious as Kawaji about the truth behind the case of the money-lender's mistress, yet he seemed to have little interest in such petty crime. Kawaji, on the other hand, could not help feeling that this was a real discovery. The true purpose of the Imperial Prosecuting Office was to root out corrupt officials. However, and their current focus was the Yamashiroya case. Towards the end of the second month, the blanket of smoke that had been hanging over it suddenly lifted to reveal a body. That day, after completing his morning rounds, Kawaji arrived at the Imperial Prosecuting Office to find a note from Kazuki informing him that he had gone to the jail to supervise the guillotine and that Kawaji should come there immediately, as there was an important matter to discuss. Kawaji rushed through the rain, which was falling like threads of silk. Threads of silk. Since he was coming from the Sakurada gate, he would enter through the back of the jail, but just as he was passing it, the rear gate creaked open. This gate was only opened when executed criminals had to be taken to Kozu Kapara. As he looked on, wondering whether the execution had already taken place and the bodies were now being transported, a horse appeared, pulling a cart. A peasant-looking man with a filthy beard and wearing a rain hat and straw mino raincoat was trudging ahead of it, holding the reins. The cart behind him was laden with crates. They were too small to be coffins, though. And seeing them, Kawaji laughed. The gong farmer had come to take away the many pails of prison excrement. Kawaji carried on around the side of the jail and entered through the front gate, only to find that the execution had indeed already taken place. Having been informed that Kazuki had just stepped out with Sergeant Onimaru, Kawaji was asked if he would mind waiting. He smiled to himself, wondering what this important matter could be, and took a stroll around the prison while he waited. Naturally, he took a peek in the mortuary. There, he saw 5 slightly stained coffins lying in a row, and beside them, sitting vacantly in the corner, Sergeant Ichinohata puffing away on a pipe. Surprised to see the chief inspector, he jumped to his feet. "Don't worry, I haven't come for you," said Kawaji. "Kazuki asked me to come. Do you know where he's gone?" "I've no idea," the Razotsu replied, looking confused. "He was here giving instructions for the guillotine just a minute ago. Has he gone out?" "Could it be something to do with the execution?" "I don't think so. It must be something else." Kawaji looked at the coffins. They all had their lids on, but as ever, the blood was still seeping out and the overpowering smell was nauseating. "Who were they?" "Rapists and murderers, the lot of them. Would you like to take a look, sir?" "No, thank you." Kawaji shook his head. A corpse holding its own head was never a pleasant sight to behold. "When are they being taken to Kozu Kapara?" "It's scheduled for this evening, sir." "Make sure nobody steals any of the heads this time." "Kumoi-san was one thing, sir, but I doubt anybody would want these heads. That really was a disgrace the other day, but ever since then, somebody's been on guard until they're taken to Kozu Kapara. They've tightened up security at the gate as well." Kawaji laughed. And left him to it. Chapter 4. An hour passed, then an hour and a half, and still Kazuki hadn't returned. Then, a little after 2 o'clock, Sergeant Yoko Makura came running into the jail, shouting, "Is the chief inspector here?" Ichinohata took him to find Kawaji. "What's happened?" he asked. "What's the matter?" "Oh, Chief Inspector, you must come immediately. Chief Inspector Kazuki needs you." "Where?" "Imado, sir." Imado lay just to the north of Asakusa, overlooking the Sumida River. That army accountant, you asked us there. What? All right, tell me everything on the way. The two of them went running out of the jail, and along the way, Yokomakura gave Kawaji the full story. 2 days earlier, Onimaru had been on a patrol in Asakusa when suddenly he had spotted Yataro Aoki, a notorious scoundrel. He had once been in the shogun's service, but during the chaos that preceded the restoration, he had gathered together a band of thieves and gone all across Edo, robbing people under the guise of expropriation, before finally being arrested. Expropriation. The act of expropriating, or the state of being expropriated. Specifically, the action of the state in taking or modifying the property rights of an individual as by eminent domain in the exercise of its sovereignty. Expropriate. To deprive of possession or proprietary rights. Expropriate. Synonyms include seize, take over, usurp. He had once been in the shogun's service, but during the chaos that preceded the restoration, he had gathered together a band of thieves and gone all across Edo, robbing people under the guise of expropriation, before finally being arrested. However, despite being subjected to torture more than a dozen times, he had persisted in protesting his innocence. And when the collapse of the shogunate finally came, he was granted a special pardon by Kaishu Katsu and released without without charge. Since then, however, he had not mended his ways. Only now his quarry were no longer petty merchants, but rather disreputable officials and government suppliers, because he knew that it was more efficient to extort large sums of money from them. In most cases, he could achieve his end by sending one of his henchmen, but depending on the circumstances, there were also occasions when he would have to go in person and say menacingly, "Yes, it is I, the hardened criminal, Aoki, and you'd do well not to forget it when you open your mouth to me." Those few words alone had been enough to convey the inhuman degree of his villainy, and make his adversaries tremble. Of course, if they refused to listen even then, they would be set on fire and have their unidentifiable bodies dumped somewhere. Such were the rumors of his violence. And so it was this Aoki whom Sergeant Onimaru had followed and whom he had spotted entering a certain villa in Imado. In those days, just as the stretch between Yoshiwara and Asakusa was nothing but rice paddies, so too was Imado, an area full of paddies and fields. Dotted around here and there, though, were a few forests, and the closer you got to the Sumida River, the more elegant a place became, with secluded villas scattered among the trees. After about 20 minutes, Aoki emerged wearing a sour look and walked past Onimaru, who was squatting in the bushes. After half a dozen steps, he turned around. "Hello, Sergeant," he said, practically spitting out the words. "You probably don't know this, but this here villa belongs to the famous Yamashiroya of Yokohama. There's a big army accountant hiding out there. Sure would be funny if the Imperial Prosecuting Office were to look into how that all came to be. He's a big fish, so it would be a crying shame to blow his cover. Might be an idea to stick around for now and see who's coming and going." Then, with his hands in his pockets, he sauntered off towards Yoshiwara. Onimaru duly reported all this to Kazuki. "An army accountant," he said. "Why, that could be Yasutari Yuasa. And you're saying that Aoki told you to keep an eye on the people visiting him? Could this be retaliation if Yuasa rebuffed his attempt at blackmail? It would certainly stand to reason if he's a military man. Either way, he's alright. Take a look and see who you find." From that day on, Onimaru and Yokomakura had been surveilling the villa, sometimes together, sometimes taking turns. Kawaji realized that this must be the important matter that Kazuki had mentioned. It would certainly be a turn-up for the books if Yuasa, who they had thought was back in Chōshū, was really hiding out in Imado. As they ran there, Yokomakura continued his tale. Earlier that day, just before noon, somebody had pulled up at the villa by a rickshaw. Since the vehicle had both a canopy and a curtain, they hadn't been able to identify the visitor. Whoever it was, however, they had come with 2 soldiers in tow. The 2 Razotsu were startled to see that the visitor was probably a military man of some rank, but having realized this, they knew they had to find out who it was. Yet no sooner had the rickshaw arrived at the villa than it left again. Had they just exchanged a few words standing at the door? What in the world could have made them come all this way to Imado in the rain? Unable to resist, Onimaru blocked the rickshaw's path. "What's the meaning of this?" asked the soldier, glaring at him. "By the authority of the Imperial Prosecuting Office," Onimaru replied. "I have orders to stop and identify anybody entering or leaving that house. Your name, please." From under the canopy, an ill-tempered voice replied, "Yamagata." "Sir?" "Aritomo Yamagata." Onimaru nearly jumped out of his skin. It was the deputy assistant to the Minister of War. "Sir," he said, growing more frantic, "forgive me, but I have orders to verify everyone." After a few moments of silence, the voice gave the order for the canopy to be removed. There, inside, Onimaru saw the long, sullen, stony countenance of His Excellency Aritomo Yamagata, whom he had seen somewhere before. Onimaru stood to attention and saluted. "Will that be all, Sergeant?" The rickshaw then carried on past the Razotsu, vanishing as it raced off towards Asakusa. This was why Onimaru had run all the way back to the prison and why Chief Inspector Kazuki had gone running off the minute he heard the report. Since Yamagata had already left, there was nothing that Kazuki could do, but he felt compelled to go there nonetheless. When he arrived, however, he was confronted by something quite unexpected. It happened as he was listening to the report from the two Razotsu in the woods near the villa. All of a sudden, a girl of around 16 came running out of the villa's main gate. The Rasotsu knew from their surveillance the day before that the girl was employed at the villa. There was a field nearby where a peasant hut stood, and it appeared to be her home. The girl looked distressed, so Kazuki called over to her. "We found a body!" she cried in a high-pitched voice. "The masters told me to report it to the police station in Asakusa." "Whose body?" "I don't know who he is, but his head's been cut off." "What? Inside the villa?" "No, in the field behind it. He's naked, and he's covered in manure." Their surveillance of the villa was supposed to be a secret, but hearing this, they had no choice but to investigate. The three of them rushed to the scene, guided by the girl. What they found there was a horrific spectacle, and standing beside it was none other than Yasutari Yuasa. While he was asking what had gone on here, Kazuki suddenly recalled that he had requested Kawaji to meet him at the prison, and so Yokomakura was dispatched to go and fetch him.